All right, let's go ahead and get started with the last lecture of the semester. All right, and this lecture is probably going to be fairly short. Before we get started on the lecture, though, I did just want to upview the upcoming schedule. All right, I am not going to hold in-person office hours tomorrow since I am not teaching any classes on campus. I am not going to drive down from the cities for that. But if you need to get a hold of me, I can be available via email or Zoom. You just got to let me know. Review session will be on Wednesday. All right, it'll be just like every other review session we've done this past semester. And then the final exam is on Saturday. All right, Saturday at 3:30 p.m. I believe it is in this room. I will double check, and if it is not, I will send out an email. If you have to change your schedule, your final exam schedule, for any reason, and you're changing this class, make sure you email me today. All right, after today, I'm not going to accept any more schedule changes. All right, so that is if you have a conflicting exam time, your exam's at the same time as this exam, or you have you have 3 or more exams on the same day. You can rearrange one exam to be a different day. You just got to let me know by the end of today if you are rescheduling this exam. All right, so final exam is on Saturday. All right, you have all the study guides 1 through 4, as well as those potential short essay questions. All right, so that's guaranteed 10 points. All right, so final exam itself, 65 points, and you get about an hour and 50 minutes to do so. It's going to be the same type of format that I've had previously, right? Nothing's changed formatting-wise. About 60% of it's probably going to be new material, right? So that would be study guide for exam 4, right? And about 40% of that's going to be cumulative material, right? So these are rough numbers. But out of that cumulative material, right, about 90% of that's probably going to come from these potential short essay questions. All right, so I can't guarantee that every cumulative question that I ask you will come from these short essay questions. I can guarantee that you'll see 2 of them on the exam, but I'll probably take bits and pieces to make for the rest of the cumulative portion.
Does that mean like the cumulative stuff from the short essay thing will be short essay, or will it be like from multiple choice?
2 of them will definitely be short essay, and they will appear exactly as you see them on that document. All right, the other ones I might take bits and pieces from and ask you something in a variety of other formats.
Will you like be breaking up the final exam for like exam 1, exam 2 stuff, exam 3 stuff, or just kind of all split together?
It's all going to be mixed together. Yep. All right, one thing I wanted to say is make sure you bring a calculator. All right, I'm not going to have you do any complicated calculations. All right, but you might need to calculate a few easy values that we have learned in class. Think specifically about assignment 4 and what you had to do there. All right, any questions about the final exam? All right. So on Friday, I called a partial snow day, all right, and I had you listen to a lecture online instead. I wanted to go over those review questions and answer any questions that you might have come up with while you were studying. All right, so first of all, we talked about the Shannon Diversity Index, all right, and I gave you this review question where we have 2 different habitats, one that has been unlogged and one that has been logged, all right, stripped of trees, and 2 different Shannon Diversity Indexes, all right. Which one has the higher diversity? Just looking at those 2 numbers. What was that? I think you're correct.
Okay, unlocked.
Unlogged, yes. All right, so unlogged has a higher diversity, and why is that the case? Bigger number, yeah, pretty easy. All right, so that's the big takeaway I want you to get from the equation for the Shannon Diversity Index is the bigger the number, the more diverse that area is. Right? Remember, we're taking into account the number of species and the abundance of those species. All right, we talked about this diversity stability hypothesis, and we watched that video on biodiversity. All right, and then I posed this question here, which I did not have the pictures up for yet. But which community is more stable according to that diversity stability hypothesis? We have this desert community, has about 30 species, and this tropical rainforest with about 200 species. Which one is more stable? Rainforest, yeah, why? Yeah, it has more species. So likely if one species goes extinct, it's not going to cause too big of a disturbance in the ecosystem and the community as a whole, unless what that video got into was talking about those keystone species, unless it's a keystone species. And we're really not going to focus on those species. You'll learn that in other bio classes down the road. All right, so another question relating to succession that I posed, and this one's a little bit of a lengthy one, so I'll give you a chance to read it here. All right, so we have species coming in, changing the environment a little bit, allowing for another species to come in and further change the environment. What successional theory does this follow? Facilitation, yeah. So we talked about facilitation, we talked about inhibition, but this one is definitely facilitation, very classic. All right, species are coming in, changing the environment, allowing for other species to come in and further break down the soil, add more nutrients, provide more habitats to allow other species to then colonize. All right, so the last couple of questions that I posed related to island biogeography. All right, so if we look at these islands off of Australia here, all right, would you predict Easter Island, all right, so this island out here, or New Caledonia, right, this island over here, to have a greater species richness? All right, so what is species richness? What am I talking about there? Am I talking about how many different species there are, how many individuals there are, what the abundance is? What am I talking about? All of the above? Somewhat, yeah. Talking about species richness, I'm really focusing on the number of species, all right? The number of different species that I can find. All right, so I have an island here that's closer to Australia and an island that's further away. Which one is going to have the higher species richness? Yeah, New Caledonia. It is closer to that mainland here, closer to Australia, where likely those species probably immigrated from. All right, what about in our islands over here, these Antilles Islands? Would you predict, all right, Martinique, which is this island here, or St. Vincent, this island here, to have a higher species richness? Yeah, Martinique, yeah. And why would that be? It's a bigger island. Yeah, it can hold more species. Yeah, so those are some, kind of some of those fundamental questions that researchers would ask about island biogeography. All right, any other questions about that lecture from Friday? All right, so we're going to move on to energy in the ecosystems. All right, so we've looked at species, we've looked at populations, we've looked at communities. Now we're looking at ecosystems. All right, so ecosystems, we're looking at communities, but also their interactions with all those abiotic factors. All right, so ecosystem ecology really focuses in on the movement of energy and materials through organisms and their communities. All right, so we're going to be looking at energy movement, but we could also look at materials through organisms, such as how are nutrients recycled, right? What about water? Where does water go? It might go through a plant and then be eaten by other animals and so on and so forth. All right, we're kind of looking at big picture ideas here. All right, and when we're looking at ecosystems, a lot of times we'll focus in on these food webs and food chains. All right, so food chains, you've probably seen them before. I put a couple examples up here to the side. But a food chain is really a linear depiction of energy flow. All right, so on the very bottom, we're going to have our primary producers. All right, they're typically going to be plants or something that photosynthesizes. Right, that caterpillar is going to eat the plant, that lizard's going to eat the caterpillar, and then that snake is going to eat the lizard. All right, a clear food chain. All right, so the energy is It's being produced by these plants on the bottom and being moved throughout this chain until it ends up in this snake. So each of these feeding levels is a trophic level. All right, and we'll get to that in a couple slides here. But these food chains are really linear and really straightforward, and that's not typically what we see in the environment. All right, we typically see food webs, which are a little bit more complex and complicated, right? Because we know one individual does not eat one organism typically. All right, so these food webs, we could look at the hyena eats the aardvark. Aardvark could eat the harvester ant, or it could eat a termite. Right? The harvester ant and the termite both eat red oak grass. Right? So very much more complex. We're basically taking a bunch of food chains, intertwining them into this food web. All right, so let's look at those trophic levels in our food webs and our food chains. All right, so at the very bottom, we have autotrophs. All right, so autotrophs, we are harvesting light or chemical energy to basically make our own food. All right, we're storing that energy in our chemical bonds. If we're talking about plants, that's going to be in these glucose molecules or these sugars that we're creating via photosynthesis. Right, now, a lot of the times, the primary producer, right, that's what we call the base of the food chain, it's going to be an autotroph, but most of the time it's going to be plants. Right? Most of the time you're going to see some sort of plant species, some sort of photosynthesizing species at the bottom of that food chain. But we can also have other autotrophs, such as chemoautotrophs. All right, so they're actually oxidizing some inorganic compound in order to store energy. All right, so nitrogen-fixing bacteria, they're pretty common in the soil. Right, they're going to use nitrogen in the soil as their energy source. All right, so nitrogen, inorganic compound, and that is their energy source. All right, but most of the time we're going to be looking at plants harvesting light. All right, so the next kind of level that we have in our food chain, food web system would be heterotrophs. All right, and heterotrophs, they're going to eat other organisms. All right, so they cannot make their own food. And when we're looking at heterotrophs, we can break them into several different categories. All right, so the first one would be a primary consumer. A primary consumer eats a primary producer. All right, so if we're eating a primary producer, we're typically eating plants. This would make them herbivores. All right, so if we look at our primary consumers on our little pyramid here, these squirrels, insects, birds, those would be examples of primary consumers eating our primary producers. All right, now if we go up one more level, all right, we get our secondary consumers. All right, so our secondary consumers are eating our primary consumers. All right, these would be carnivores. We are eating other heterotrophs. Now if we go all the way up to the top of the pyramid, all right, we're going to see tertiary consumers. All right, so tertiary consumers, they're eating other secondary consumers. They are eating other primary consumers. All right, we're still eating other heterotrophs. They're just higher up on that food chain, higher up on that food web. Now at the very bottom of this pyramid, they also show another class of heterotrophs. All right, so these would be detritivores or decomposers. These organisms are basically eating anything that's dead or decaying. All right, so think about an animal carcass or plants that have died and have fallen on the forest floor. We're breaking down that dead organism as our food product. All right, it could be unconsumed plants, animal remains, even waste products. All right, so typically we see worms, maybe fungi, other bacteria. They would be in this category. All right, so looking back at our food web again, right, we can start to classify our food web according to these trophic levels. All right, so we have our primary consumers, which are typically autotrophs, typically plants. All right, our primary consumers are eating our primary producers. We see we have grasshoppers, ants, termites, dung beetles, rabbits, right? They're all eating plants, eating those autotrophs. We also have those secondary consumers, all right? So they are eating other heterotrophs, all right? But they're not the top of the food chain typically. We might have these tertiary consumers like the hyena, the lion, the cheetah. Those would be top of the food chain, our tertiary consumers. Now notice that it's not so straightforward. All right, if we look at this wildebeest here, all right, we don't just have carnivores and herbivores, we also have omnivores. All right, so this wildebeest, depending on which food chain or links that you're looking at in our food web here, right, we might consider this wildebeest a primary consumer because it's directly eating grass. We might also consider it being a secondary consumer, right, because it's eating grasshopper, which then eats the grass. Right, so it's not so straightforward, and depending on where we're looking in the food chain, might change our outcome or our answer of what trophic level an organism might fall into. All right, now food webs typically have very short chain lengths. All right, so I'm talking about chain lengths. I'm talking about how many links there are between different organisms. All right, so if we look at this hyena, all right, we have one link between the hyena and the wildebeest. All right, the wildebeest and the grasshopper is another link, and the grasshopper and this red oak grass is another link. Right, so we have 1, 2, 3 links there. All right, now in food webs, they're typically pretty short. All right, so usually less than 6 chain links, less than 6 levels. All right, this hyena example only had 3 levels. All right, this is based on physics and chemistry, specifically the second law of thermodynamics. Right, energy conversions are not 100% efficient. Right, we're going to lose some energy from one organism to the next. Right, so if we get beyond these tertiary consumers, right, we wouldn't have enough energy to sustain life. We're going to get to that in just a little bit here. Actually, we're going to get to that now. Excuse me, I thought I had a group question in there. All right, so living organisms, they use energy. All right, so in each trophic level, right, that organism is going to use energy to maintain itself. All right, so if we look at a diagram here, right, we have available free energy on the y-axis, and we have different trophic levels on that x-axis. If we look at plants, right, they have the highest free energy, right, but we notice there's a little bit of a slant here, right, that's indicating that we're using some of that energy for our own metabolism, right, so some of that energy is being used by that individual. Now say we get an herbivore coming around and munching on that plant, trying to gain some energy, right, that herbivore is going to gain a lot of that plant's energy, but we're missing out on a bunch. Right? It's not efficient. We are losing some energy in the process. And we can see that as we go further and further along on our trophic levels, all right, those higher up on our food chains are going to get less of that energy that was originally available. All right, so again, if we go from carnivore 2 to carnivore 1, all right, we're gaining about maybe half of the energy that carnivore 1 had to offer, right, because we are inefficient at that energy transfer. Right, where it's not 100% efficient, we are losing some in the process. All right, one thing I wanted to touch on was also biomagnification. So we talked about energy and how we're losing energy the higher we go up on our food web because it's inefficient at transfer. Biomagnification, we're looking at certain chemicals, right? And actually we're looking at chemicals that will magnify as we go up our food web. Really good example of this is DDT. All right, so that's an insecticide that was used a lot in the early part of this century or early part of the 1900s here. It really persists in the environment. Right? It does not degrade very easily. It's very low solubility in water. So if we look at our diagram here, the DDT in water is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 zeros and a 3 parts per million. Right? It's really low in concentration in the water. Right, but we have these organisms that will start to concentrate that in their fats, right? And it really starts to concentrate in these fats very well. So the zooplankton have a higher concentration of DDT at 0.04 parts per million. Right now, as we go up the food chain, right, these small fish are eating lots of zooplankton, so they're accumulating more DDT. Right? These larger fish, they're eating lots of these smaller fish. Right, and even further accumulating DDT until we get to these larger organisms that are more or less at the top of the food chain. They have eaten a bunch of these big fish, which have these large concentrations. They have accumulated this DDT in their fats to the point where now they have 25 parts per million. Right, compared to where we started at in the water, that's an increase of 10 million times. Right, so we're greatly magnifying the concentration of this chemical in our tertiary consumers. All right, now, With DDT specifically, right, this interferes with eggshell formation. So down here we have a normal egg and an egg that has been impacted by DDT. All right, we can see it will have some severely detrimental effects there. It's going to decrease population sizes because these individuals are not surviving. All right, these eggs are just not suitable environments for reproduction to occur. All right, now the U.S. actually banned DDT in the 1970s, but it's still used in other countries. All right, so it's still out there. And this biomagnification isn't just seen with DDT. It can be seen in lead, many other chemicals that can be introduced into the environment. All right, so let's step back, do a quick group review, and I want you to look at this image and decide what's the difference between a food web and a food chain, and then identify out all those trophic levels in this food web. All right, take a few minutes to do so.
You are correct.
All right, so what's the difference between a food web and a food chain? All right, so I think what Allison is trying to say with the hand movements for the food web is that it's more complex.
There we go.
All right. Yes, food web is more complex. We are taking a bunch of food chains and combining them together. Food chain is very linear. All right, so let's look at our food web to the side here. And what is our primary producer? Grasses, yeah. That one's easy. We only have one in this example. All right, what about our primary consumers? Rabbit, mouse, grasshopper. Yes, I would concur with that. All right, now what about our secondary consumers?
Bird, frog, owl, fox.
All right, so I considered fox, owl, frog, and bird one of them. But as I was looking at this more closely, all right, we could maybe consider the hawk also to be a secondary consumer, depending on which lineage of the food chain we're looking at here. All right, so if the hawk is eating the mouse and the mouse is eating the grass, right, that would be an example of being a secondary consumer. All right, so that only leaves one trophic level left, which is what? Tertiary consumer, yes. And what is a tertiary consumer in this image? Snake and the hawk. I would also consider the owl in there. All right, again, depending on which way we're looking at our food web. All right, and we're looking at the owl, frog, grasshopper, grasses, I would consider that to be a tertiary consumer lineage. All right, hopefully that makes sense to everybody. I think it's fairly easy to follow the food webs there. All right, so we have one last topic to touch on, and that is biomass production in ecosystems. All right, and when we're looking, or when ecosystem ecologists are looking at different ecosystems, this is something that they're often going to look at is biomass production. So biomass production is basically all the weight of the above ground living organisms combined, also with the below ground organisms. All right, so we're looking at the weight, the total weight of all the organisms in our ecosystem combined. All right, so we're looking at gross primary productivity. All right, this is a way to kind of look at biomass production. We're looking at gross, and we're looking at primary. Right, primary should indicate we're looking at the bottom of the food chain. Right, we're looking at the carbon fixed during photosynthesis. All right, so that carbon fixed during photosynthesis, it's what is allowing plants to grow and accumulate more mass. All right, so that's the gross primary productivity. All right, but plants, they also need to undergo cellular respiration. Right, so they're going to use some of that biomass to fuel their own metabolic needs. Right, so we're going to lose a little bit of energy because of plant cellular respiration. All right, and this is how we get net primary productivity. All right, so net primary productivity is just that gross primary productivity minus the energy lost in plant cellular respiration. All right, so this net primary productivity, this is really the energy available to those primary consumers. All right, energy available, but remember it's not the total energy those primary consumers are going to get because energy transfer is very inefficient. Right? Typically we would measure this in calories. Now if we're talking about secondary production, this is where we start to break down the ecosystem into categories and look at the gain in the biomass of heterotrophs and decomposers. Right? So the specific weight of those heterotrophs or decomposers in the soil. Now there's a lot of influence on primary productivity. Right? So how primary productivity is influenced in the environment. It's really linear with annual precipitation. All right, so we see as we have more precipitation in the environment, the net primary productivity is going to increase in this very linear fashion. All right, this example is specifically looking at grassland productivity. The more precipitation, the more biomass, the more plant mass that we have in our environment. Now with temperatures, all right, we see kind of the same thing here. All right, we're increasing in our net primary productivity as temperature is increasing. And the way that researchers measure this is we can look at evapotranspiration rates to kind of predict primary productivity. So evapotranspiration, that's a fancy word for saying we're looking at the amount of water being lost through the stomata of plants. All right, so researchers often look at that as an indicator. And then finally, the nutrients in the environment can severely limit the biomass production. Right? Specifically nitrogen and phosphorus. Right? Those are macronutrients that are often the most limiting in an environment. Right? So if we look at our net above ground primary productivity with different treatments in this experiment, we see we have our control treatment. We see that we have a treatment where we added just phosphorus. Nothing really happened there. All right? We look at the one where just nitrogen was added, and we see a great increase in the amount of net primary production. Right? Now we added nitrogen and phosphorus, and that increased even further. Right? So likely what's happening here is the phosphorus can't do anything until it also gets nitrogen in its system. Right? Nitrogen is probably the more limiting factor in this particular environment. Right, but we can see as we add in nutrients, we get more biomass produced, all right, more net primary productivity. And this really gets into that law of minimum, basically saying a species biomass or abundance is limited by the scarcest factor, all right, whether that's nutrients, whether that's rain, whether that's temperature, all right, something is limiting it. All right, if we're looking at aquatic ecosystems, all right, what's the limiting factor here is typically going to be light and nutrient availability. So in water, all right, the further we go down, the less light we have because water is going to absorb light. All right, so if we're looking at, say, algal growth, they are photosynthetic organisms. They need light. All right, if we are going further and further down into the water column, we're depleting the light. right? So it limits the depth of how far these algae can grow in the water column. They have to stay relatively near the top where there's still light available, rather than further down. Another very limiting factor often in water or in aquatic ecosystems is nutrients, specifically nitrogen and phosphorus. Right? They're typically very low in concentrations. Now, most of the organisms that live in these aquatic ecosystems are adapted to living with these low concentrations of nutrients. All right? They, through millions of years of evolution, have been adapted to these low nutrient availabilities. All right? But some species like algae, right, when they get an influx of nitrogen or phosphorus, they can take advantage of that. All right, so we get these algal blooms that result from a lot of nitrogen and a lot of phosphorus entering into our waters. All right, so an algal bloom, all right, is just this huge increase in the rate of reproduction of these species. We can see this is an image taken off of Lake Erie. All right, this algal bloom we can see is all green here. All right, we're rapidly increasing our rate of reproduction in these species. Now this can be problematic, all right, because we're increasing the rate of reproduction. This particular species is consuming a lot of the other resources available, typically oxygen. All right, so they're kind of depleting the amount of oxygen that can reach below this algal level, all right, to maybe where fish are. So if they're depleting oxygen, reaching those lower levels, a lot of other organisms can start to die off. A lot of fish will die off and wash ashore when we see these algal blooms. Now, a lot of these times, algal blooms are caused by farming, all right, applying, what's the word I'm looking for? We're applying resources, fertilizer. We're applying fertilizer to these farmlands. All right, and if we don't have an adequate buffer between the farmland and our water sources, we can get runoff into that water, which will start to accumulate until eventually hits this larger body of water here and causes these algal blooms. All right, so this is fairly common in a lot of agricultural prone regions. Lake Erie very specifically has this problem. All right, so primary productivity varies. Right? It varies for a lot of different reasons. Some kind of trends that we might see in primary productivity is that we might have really high productivity in rainforests, tropical rainforests. We have high temperature, we have lots of precipitation. Might decrease progressively towards the poles, right, where we're getting colder, maybe less precipitation, maybe not. This might lead into that latitudinal gradient of species richness that we see. So remember when we looked at a map, species richness tends to be lower at the poles rather than at the equator. So this could have some sort of interplay with that. And then if we look at marine production, we typically see it highest on coral reefs. Right? We have a higher species richness. These coral reefs are often growing where there's lots of temperature or higher temperature and lots of light. All right, so if we look at our map here, we can kind of see some of those trends. On land, the darker the green, right, the more productivity we have. In the ocean, the closer we get to red, the higher chlorophyll concentration we have, which indicates productivity. We don't see much red, so typically areas that are greener tend to have more productivity. We can see where there might be coral reefs, we have high productivity. We have high productivity in forests, all right, specifically rainforests that are maybe near the equator. Right, so there's a lot of variation depending on environmental factors. The last slide I wanted to show you, I thought just depicted energy flow in an ecosystem very well. All right, so we're looking at the Georgia salt marsh. All right, it's a very productive ecosystem. But I think this image really gets across how much energy we are losing. All right, so Spartina is a species of saltgrass and algae. All right, they're taking in the sunlight, creating energy. All right, so they're photosynthesizing. About 77% of that energy is going to be used in plant cellular respiration, and only 22% is going to be passed along to the rest of the food chain. Right now, that's further broken up, all right, by our primary consumers, and our secondary consumers are getting even less. Right? If we look at our decomposers, all right, they are decomposing everything else that dies off. Right? And as we get further along the food chain, when we look at our decomposers, we see less and less energy is available. until finally we get a certain percentage that just isn't used, all right, and that's typically going to be washed out to sea. All right, so the further we get along, the less energy we have. Any questions on that material? All right, that is the last material that I'm going to give you. I do have a course evaluation link set up. All right, so I value imports. All right, I want to improve on my own teaching. This is the website where you can find it at. All right, so I think the instructions online said you had to open a new private or incognito window to open this. And the website is that sri.gac.edu. I'm going to write this on the board, right? Because once I make sure everybody is logged in successfully, that wants to take the exam, right, I'm going to head out. I will be in my office until the end of class time, so if you do have questions, feel free to stop by. Other than that, I might see you Wednesday for that study session, and definitely on Saturday. Is everybody getting in okay? All right, sounds good. I'm going to head out then, and if you have questions, stop by my office.